speakers has 15 minutes because we do want to keep options open for as much conversation among us as possible. So I'm going to now pass the mic to Chris and to Adrian. We only have this one mic, but it does work.
Thank you. So I guess I'm just going to disclose this right now, in case you have any questions. I just wrote this on the GO train. So, okay. So my idea for today's discussion is trying to begin a dialogue and having different authors speak for themselves, particularly Cedric Robinson and his concept of Black Marxism, and Featherston's concept of solidarity and internationalism, and Fanon's intentions to stretch Marxism to develop a new set of analytical tools. I also speak fast. Apologize. You can curse me afterwards or throw coffee, okay? That's happened before. Okay. Je suis désolé. Okay. Okay. To stretch, to develop a new set of analytical tools to examine and understand the phenomenon of Caribbean migration of the seasoned agricultural farm workers. As pressures from above forces conversations about rights-based frameworks, such as current discussions of integrating labor rights into the free trade agreements, and appeals for help from the International Labour Organization, these mechanisms serve to disempower all workers, especially migrant workers. When thinking through solidarity, we need to refocus who and what constitutes solidarity and internationalism. Thinking of the movement of migrant workers challenges notions of place, local, and global. In fact, borders in general. And that comes from Adrian here. Thinking through current historical forms of resistance, there needs to be seen as part of a longer tradition of resistance rather than a disjointed and unorganized series of actions. Featherstone highlights the role of dock workers who, as transnational actors, share and are informed by the various ports they visited. They also were active in revolutionary struggles and distributed materials from one location to another. Similarly, migrant workers served a similar purpose in previous periods, and their movements also means that they are involved and participate in many different forms of resistance from one place to another. Strikes in Ontario, Washington, and Mexico show the power of resistance of farm workers. It doesn't necessarily just occur as ad hoc, but emerge through organic interactions from one space to another. Furthermore, as NAFTA and other forms of capital mobility are renegotiated to further accentuate the power of capital, we need to envision where sites of resistance occur, and where do we move from there? How do we think about the movement of people, the portability and entitlements and frameworks to protect vulnerable communities? This is exemplified through works undertaken by the injured worker movements and organizations such as Injured Workers Action for Justice, who are organizing with migrant workers here in Ontario, but also trying to organize with workers in the Caribbean and Mexico to address the racism that workers face in the compensation system. So the challenges then become is how do we address the invisibility that migrant workers face? How do we build transnationally just using migrant workers and having migrant workers as a focus? And how do we begin to develop new tools that looks at resistance, not from on top, but from ground roots? So I'm going to stop there and then turn it over to Adrian.
Who's just writing his notes now.
Great.
Just teasing. Okay, thank you everybody. What I want to do is actually pick up on a little bit of what Chris has said, but add a couple of
Mike,
different...
please, Adrian.
Sorry,
Yeah.
add a couple of different dimensions. One being the policing of migrant bodies, laboring bodies, and then questions about emancipation. Just very quickly, in my own work, I've examined how the Canadian state's approach to immigration and migration and border enforcement seeks to capitalize on uneven development and the hierarchical state system as a way of structuring not merely labor markets, but in fact a wider social life of migrant and immigrant workers. The state converts this unevenness and hierarchy into labor unfreedom and then into what some folks call precarious migration status, through which peoples of the global south are rendered subordinate and inferior as they enter into, on a recurring basis, work and wider social relations within the global north. And of course, those that know something about history know that this is not a historical accident. It's not a coincidence. It's not a twist of fate. This is the product of colonialism, colonization, capitalist imperialism, and these, of course, are racialized processes and practices. So we had a concrete example of how this actually occurs on the ground not too long ago, in October 2013, when the Ontario Provincial Police, the OPP, the Elgin County Detachment, engaged in a DNA sweep of migrant workers. So this was in the context of a sexual assault investigation, where a woman had reported being assaulted by an unknown assailant, later described in the subject or suspect description as a black male ranging between 5'10" and 6 feet tall, muscular build, mid to late 20s in age, no facial hair, and wearing a gray hoodie of course, black. Dark pants, I think also black people wear dark pants a lot, and then white socks. Of course, I don't at all, in making fun of the subject, the suspect description, I don't, of course, at all mean to undermine the idea or the existence of sexual assault that occurred on the body of this woman, or that occurs as a general proposition within Canadian society and wider, on a regular basis. The DNA sweep occurred in a way that captured every single migrant worker in the surrounding environment. And I think it was something like 100 or so workers were caught in this DNA sweep. In a nice piece of activist research, Justice for Migrant Workers, led by Chris's work on the ground, undertook interviews of these workers, at least 40 or more. And it was obvious, not just by sort of, looking at the workers, we can do like a visual inspection, but from their stories, that they didn't fit within the reasonable parameters of the suspect description. Not that, we could talk about this kind of idea of reasonable parameters too, but let's just pretend that that's an okay kind of way of thinking. Lawyers think it's okay, so let us do the same. Long story short, Justice for Migrant Workers, through these interviews, in which I wasn't part of the interview process, but I was privy to the data and it helped draft the complaint. We issued a complaint to the Office of the Independent Police Review Director, OPERD, which is the police oversight body within Ontario. Everyone knows that oversight is a joke. It's a joke. There's no such thing as police oversight. Or maybe another way of saying there is police oversight. It's an oversight that just allows for the process to continue, the process of policing. What we called in the report racialized policing, following COMAC. It's not racial profiling in the sort of way that we could say, oh, there's some bad apples who engage in these kinds of activities, but it's not what police normally do, but actually it's the systematic commitment to maintaining a racialized order. Not just a racialized order, in the way that I think Commanding Banerjee and others have so nicely pointed out, it's a racialized class order, right? Racialized and gendered class order. They're always already operating together, those markers of distinction, and we should never separate. And so we made this intervention. All I want to do is actually just point out that in the context of contemporary struggles, where we see this growth, important growth, I think, in sort of the anti-policing struggles, right, against what some people are calling anti-black racism. Of course, linked to Black Lives Matters. What I want to say is, I think we need to be a little careful in the way we construct these kinds of narratives. There's an important intervention, to be sure, that's being forcefully made through Black Lives Matters, but we have to ensure that we are not pushing all of these different forms of oppression together in a way that continues the invisibilization of certain kinds of workers. And I think one way we could talk about it is through the concept of policing. And quite narrowly, when in popular terms, when we talk about policing, we talk about it as an institution or an apparatus of the state, right? Designed to enforce laws and preserve order. The police. And you're not going to believe this, but I'm going to side with Foucault here. Foucault, nobody say this to anybody else outside of this room. I think Foucault rightly sort of said we need an all-encompassing idea of policing. We have to see. I'll deny all of this. I'll say you drove me and all kinds of stuff. We need an all-encompassing concept of policing that sees it as a mode of governance or a form of rationality, essential to the creation or constitution of the modern state. But I think we need to go further than that, and Mark Neoculus has intervened on this and said that Foucault and Foucauldians fail to see that the policing function is one of coercion, which is material to the adoption of the capitalist wage economy, and its perpetuation and continuation. And then I would go even further than Neoculus and say, don't forget that policing is about, as I said earlier, a racialized and gendered class. It has a racialized and gendered class logic, a logic which territorializes. Whether we talk about it territorializing in the context of Elgin County and the OPP and what they did in this DNA sweep, or we can bring in other examples. I've written in a paper called The Bunkhouse Rules about Norfolk County. And this is, again, something that Chris has been active in context. There were disputes over migrant worker housing. Where should we house migrant workers? And the locals were restless, right? The locals were up in arms about housing migrant workers, these racialized bodies within their communities. As one person said in Tecumseh, I'm not against migrant workers if they are spaced out. Not the Chris spaced out. I'm not against migrant workers if they are spaced out.
But you're against me.
Spaced out among.
More microaggressions.
Let me finish the quote. Spaced out among Tecumseh or even through Windsor. Right, this idea of territorial spacing, but also constructing Windsor, Tecumseh, Norfolk County as spaces that migrant workers do not belong in. Notwithstanding the fact that, of course, these are areas in which those who fled the slavery that existed in the US moved to, and their bodies have been functioning on the land for a long time. And that says nothing about the indigenous bodies that have lived there for 10,000 years or longer, as indigenous peoples themselves say since time immemorial. Right? Communities don't care about that. The peoples in the communities and their construction of it. So there's a certain kind of policing going on. I'm going to try to move to a wrap up here. What I'm trying to say then is we need to conceive of policing in a much broader sense, in the sense that sees it as part of what capitalism is committed to, and it demonstrates the limit. It is, by definition, the limit of capitalism. And it has a territorial dimension to it, which again is about the limit of capitalism. And it's from there that we can start to think about the remakings of the world in which we live. And I think workers and groups like Justice for Migrant Worker, and Chris has been central to this, notwithstanding some of the shortcomings. Pushing past these territorial borders and boundaries. You know, James Baldwin had a really nice quote where he said, "We carry history with us, within us." And I think that's quite important for us to remember that migrant workers, we all, within us, carry these histories. We wear them in terms of the racialized construction of people, the racialized and gendered class construction of people. But we also can reach back within those histories of unfreedom that have come before. The remnants that we see now, labor and freedom, which link back to indentured servitude and slavery and so on. We can find brilliant struggles. Rebellion and resistance, the sign that slaves were human too. Sylvia Wynter, for example, talks about slaves populating lived spaces and landscapes, spirits, dances, stories. Others have added to this and talked about this as a counter-symbolic world in which slaves and others have constructed. Migrant workers are doing this every day, and I think it's important that we stay attuned to that. And in our transnational struggles and our desire to construct what Featherstone has called internationalism from below, we have to keep real the realities of these struggles which exist in ourselves. Thank you.
I think just trying to link the two, for us to reconceptualizing policing is not something that's to a particular geographic location, but thinking of the combination of how border services and police service regulate racialized migrant workers' bodies. And Evelyn Encolada, who's very close and also a member of Justicia, always talks about that the borders are on the bodies, right? So how the borders construct migrant workers. And I think for myself is trying to link what we're talking about, racialization of migrant workers, in connection to thinking about solidarity and rethinking about what Black Marxism can be as we move